Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. This is Yeshayahu, Isaiah 44, and we'll be studying chapter Mem Daled, Perek Mem Daled of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah. This is Saul Weinreb, the host of your podcast. Just a really quick review. In 43, there was, I guess we can summarize 4 main points that God made and through his prophet Yeshayahu. The first point was that his love and dedication and devotion towards the Jewish people as his chosen nation was forever, that he would not abandon them no matter how much suffering there would be. He would make sure that they survive and flourish. Number 2, he said that the punishments that were visited upon the Jewish people over the centuries were due to their sins. And number 3, that they themselves, that the reason for God's delivering and redeeming the Jewish people was because of his own righteousness, because God himself desires them and wants to help them come to a point where they recognize him and sing his praises. And number 4, that God is going to give justice to the entire world, any nation, and every nation that comes forward and calls out in God's name will be welcome in the future time, and the oppressors of all nations will suffer, and justice will be meted out. With that, we begin chapter 44, and here specifically God turns and addresses the Jewish people directly. So, and tells them a message. If you imagine, now God gave all these assurances that he just gave. The people are going to think, well, why should we trust this God and these promises that this prophet is telling us about? And how is this different from all the other false promises and all the other there's so many things we've had faith in over the years, so many ideologies, so many philosophical ideas, and so many movements, so many leaders have gotten up. They've all made all kinds of promises and everything, none of which have led to anything other than eventual destruction. How do we know that this one is anything different? So here God addresses that problem, and he says, V'ata, and now, Shema Yaakov Abdi, listen, my servant Jacob, V'Yisrael bocharti bo, listen, Israel, of whom I have chosen him. So says God, the one who created you, the one who made you, the one who has been helping you ever since you have developed in your mother's womb. In other words, all the way back in the beginning, I have been with you this entire time. Al tira abdi Yaakov, do not be afraid, my servant Yaakov. This phrase appears in many parts of the literature. Al tira, do not be afraid, my servant Jacob. V'Yishurun b'charti bo, and Yishurun, which is another name for the people of Israel, of whom I have chosen. Don't be afraid, don't be scared. I know you are, but don't be afraid. Because ki etzok mayim al tzomei, just like now in the future, I am going to give water to the thirsty. This is a metaphor which God has used numerous times in these last few chapters, that in the future God will quench the thirst of the people of the world. This is meant literally that the people that are thirsty and hungry will be fed and given to drink, and also a little bit more figuratively, that in a spiritual way, the thirst for God, the thirst for knowledge. And just like I am going to give water to the dry land. This is a reference again to the things which God has mentioned over and over and over again about how he will restore nature to its beauty and splendor. Just like I am going to do that, also at Sok Ruchi al Zarecha, I am going to pour my spirit upon your children, Uvirchasi, and my blessings al Tzatzaecha, upon your descendants. I am going to give them, just like I'm going to save the entire world, and just like I'm going to restore nature to its proper balance and beauty, I am going to give sustenance and spirit to your children and your grandchildren, etc. And don't worry, they will sprout just like grass sprouts in the field, like willows that grow along the shores of rivers that have a bountiful, plentiful water source that they grow so nicely. This God is, this one will say to God, Ani, I am yours. I am of God. V'zeh yikra v'shem Yaakov, and this one will call out in the name Yaakov and say, yes, I am a Jew. I am proud. I am one of these people. V'zeh yichtov yado Adonai, and this one will write upon his arm. This is most likely a reference to the practice of tefillin, of binding God's name to one's arm. I will say, my arm is for God. Uv'shem Yisrael yichaneh, and he will take upon himself the name of Israel. This is very reminiscent and is important. I'll just mention the Radak points out that this pasuk reflects. Just give me 1 second. Israel, those that remain of the people of Israel, these are the words of Radak. Kulam yu kedoshim, they will all be holy. V'kulam yikru shehem lashem, they will all call out that yes, I am of God. V'shehem mizer Yaakov, and yes, I am of the Jewish people. K'mosh Amar, like we said earlier, if we look back at chapter 4, verse 3. Again, this is another reference to ideas that were expressed in Yeshayahu before, another place where we see the continuity and unity of authorship of this entire book. But let's read chapter 4, verse 3, where it says, V'hayaha nishar b'tzion, those that remain in Zion, v'hanosar b'Yerushalayim, those that remain in Jerusalem, kadosh ye'amer lo, people will say of them, kadosh, right? They are holy. Kol ha'kosuv l'chayim b'Yerushalayim, all that are written for life in Jerusalem. So again, the people of that remain will call themselves and will be called holy, will be called of the Jewish people, they will be called of God's people. Let's move on with verse 6. Ko amar Adonai melech Yisrael v'go'alo. So says God. Again, God is trying to reassure them. Well, I have been with you all the way from the beginning. Don't be afraid. Don't worry. I am going to give spirit to your children. I will be there for your descendants. I'm not going to abandon you like all the other ideologies that have failed over time. I am not like that. And how do I know that? Because God says, I am the King of Israel, v'go'alo. I am the Redeemer, Adonai Tziva'os. I am the God of hosts. Ani Rishon, I have been here from the beginning. I am the first. I am the start. V'ani Acharon, and I am the last. I will be here after everything else. There is nothing, there is no God other than me. It's not like there's other gods that made promises and didn't fulfill, and this God and that. No, that's not how it works. There's no ideology that has all of the truth and will answer all of the problems. No, there's no such thing. There is only one, and that's me, God. Who is like me that can announce, can call something out via gida, via chali, and can speak and say things, and somehow evaluate things regarding me. There's no one that can even assess me, can evaluate me. It can't be done, right? Misumi ad olam, right? Who can be the one who can Misumi amolam, who can do what I did, which was to create a nation that's going to last forever. The osios Asher Tavono Yagidulamo, and the signs that I have put out, and the ideas that I have put out, and that which I have stated what will going to be happening in the future, I have stated in the past. No one else can do that. The prophecies of this book, a book written thousands and thousands of years ago that foretells the future history of the people that I have chosen, and that it should come true. No one has done such a thing. No one can do such a thing. No one would even dare do such a thing other than God himself. Al tifchadu, do not be afraid. V'al tirhu, and don't start thinking and wondering, maybe this is not so true. Halome ozish maticha, from all the way in the back time I have given you direction. V'gadti, and I told you, v'atem doi, and you have borne witness. You have been witness to the promises I have made you in the past. You have been witness to the ideas and the Torah that I have given you in the past. Bal yira'o, therefore do not I'm sorry, I skipped a little. Hayesh Elohami baladai, is there any other God beside me? Ve'ein tzur bal yodati, is there any other tzur? Is there any other rock? A rock being something that's faithful, something that remains for time, that no matter what he says and promises, it does happen. He's always there. Bal yodati, I know of nothing else, God says, other than me. Yotzrei Fessel Kulam Tohu, all those other ideas, all of those other pagan philosophies, all of those other ideologies that have popped up over the centuries that have claimed to be what's going to redeem the world, they are all just creators of Pesel. They're creators of idols, right? They Kulam Tohu, they are all nothing. Vachamudeim, and those that desire them, Balyo Ilu, they do not help, they do not say anything. Ve'edeim Hema, and they themselves can testify. See those ideologies, see those ideas, see those philosophies, see those idols. They are witnesses of their own destruction. They are witnesses of their own failure. Ask them and you'll see they have nothing to offer. And they themselves will show and demonstrate how they have failed. Bal yiru uval yidu laman yevoshu. They cannot see anything. They do not know anything, in order that in the end they just become embarrassed. Mi yatzar elu fesel nasach. Who can possibly create a god? Who can possibly pour metal in order to create an idol? Levilti ho'il, something that does nothing. Who can do that? The only one that does that is a human being. These are human creations. Since these ideologies, ideas, idols are just human creations, right? They're the only ones that can make these things. So they're nothing better than the arrogance of the human that made them. Hein kol chaverav yavoshu. All of those that gather around them and believe in them will end up being embarrassed. They will be ashamed because their projects will fail. V'chorashim heima me'adam. They are crafted only by people. Yiskabzu chulam yamodu. They will all together get together and stand. Yifchadu yevoshu yachad. They would all be embarrassed all at the same time. Nothing will come of them. Chorash barzel ma'atzod, the craftsman who creates iron with his tools. Ufo'al ba'pecham, and he works with over coals in order to melt and mold the metals. Uvemakavot yisrehu, and then with hammers he turns it into shapes. Vayifaleo bezroa kocho, and he makes it with what? With the strength of his hand. Gam ro'ev ein koach. That person, if he was hungry, and he would have no strength. In other words, this God, this thing, and this idea, this ideology was simply something that was created by him. And when in the end, when he needs something, it can't provide. The thing itself looks to the human being for creation, looks to the human being in order to be made into something. The thing itself can't do anything for the person. It was made by the person. If he has nothing to drink or water not to drink, he'll just be thirsty. He can't go to his creation and ask it for water. It doesn't work. The person who crafts with wood and he measures with a line in order to make a straight line, and he makes a shape with a form, and he uses scraping tools in order to make a form out of the wood. And he marks it out with a kind of tool that makes angles, a compass. And then what does he do? What kind of form does he make? He makes the form of a human being. And this doesn't necessarily, it could mean that he makes an idol that in the form of a human being, but what it means is whatever form he makes, whatever a human being creates, is something that is in the form of a human being. It is what the human being decided to make. Kitiferetz Adam lo shebet bayit. It's the beauty of a human being, so that it can sit in a house, in a shrine. The things that we make, we fashion in our own form. They can't be something from which we derive any kind of benefit, because we ourselves made it. And what happens? L'chros lo arazim. The person goes ahead. How does he create these things? By chopping down trees. Vayikach tirzava alon. These are two types of trees. Can translate them as cedars and oak trees. Vayametz bo ba'atzei yahar. And he strengthens it by cutting down the forest with the trees of the forest. Nita oren v'geshem yigadel. Or he plants trees, a certain kind of an oren, a type of tree, and which grow through the ground, grow from nature, and he goes ahead and chops them down. In order to create what he creates, he has to destroy nature. This again is Yeshayahu going back on ideas which were expressed earlier. Let's look back for a moment. I want to read to you from chapter 2, again going back to ideas that Yeshayahu mentioned before. If we look back at chapter 2, I'm going to read a bit from there just to remind us of what we learned before, but this is something that will shed a tremendous amount of light on what he's saying now. In Yeshayahu and Isaiah chapter 2, I'm going to start with verse 11. Isaiah was criticizing then the arrogance of man. I'm going to start Einei Gavut Adam V'Shafel, right? Shafel, the Einei Gavut, the haughty eyes of the lowly man, V'Shach Ruman Hashem, and at the time and in the future, God is going to lower the haughtiness of man. V'Niskav Adonai Levado Bayom, when only God will be exalted. And it continued in verse 12 and 13, and pay attention. Ki yom la'Adonai tzvaos al kol ge'ev aram v'al kol nisav v'shafel. God will be above all of the arrogant human beings, and He will lower them. V'al kol arzei halevanon, and on all of the cedars of Lebanon, haramim v'hanisoim v'al kol alonei habashan, on the cedars of Lebanon that are so high and so great, and the oak trees of Bashan, v'al kol heharim haramim, in the mountains, and so on and so forth, and it goes on. V'shach gavus adam, to verse 17, and then what is God? Because again, God is drawing the line between the haughtiness and arrogance of man and how he abuses nature. And when God uplifts, when God lowers man who's so arrogant and so high and haughty about himself, God then redeems nature from the abuse that man meets upon it. Right, and then at the end of that particular part, V'shach, in verse 17, chapter 2, I'm reading from, V'shach gavus adam, v'shafel roman Hashem, again the same idea, V'niskav Adonai levado bayomu, that's how God raises himself up in the world. And then if we look at verse 17, which I just read, and 18, V'ha'elilim kolil yachlof, immediately what's the next relationship? I'm sorry, I didn't read the whole verse. Ki yom la'Adonai tzva. I'm sorry, I did read verse 17, and immediately after, V'niskav Adonai levado bayomu, and God will be great, V'ha'elilim kolil yachalof, and God is going to get rid of the false gods, the idols. Again, that relationship is between human arrogance and avodah zarah, and idol worship. God continues to say, Bayomahu in verse 20, and get still in reading chapter 2, the man will then throw out the false gods made of silver and gold, asher asu lo, that he made for himself, lishtachavos. The same ideas that he's saying here, that when man is arrogant, man creates things and then worships the creations of himself. He's worshiping himself. He's worshiping what he made himself. The same ideas that Yeshayahu is expressing now in chapter 44, which we're currently studying. And then, just to continue, the last verse of chapter 2 really drives this point home, and I want you to think about this. Chidlu lochem min adam, stay away from human beings. God, leave people alone. Stop thinking that people are so great. Stop worshiping yourselves. Stop worshiping human being. Asher neshama bi'apo. The human being is just a person. Kiva menach shavu. What is he? He's nothing. The human being is nothing. He's just himself. The only reason why he's anything is because of his relationship with God. This is what we just read over there in chapter 2, which sheds a tremendous amount of light on what we're reading right now in chapter 44. So I'm going to go back. I'm up to verse 15. And bear in mind what we just read from chapter 2. All of these things, these trees that he chopped down, what does he do? He uses them to destroy them, to burn them, to create a fire. And he takes the wood and he warms himself up. And then he uses the fire and he makes food, he bakes bread. And then he takes the same wood that he would have otherwise burned and used as fuel, he uses it to make a god. And he bows to it. And he goes, he creates an idol and he bows down to it. This is the human being taking He uses the world, he abuses the world, he destroys and burns the world for his own benefit, and then he worships his very abuse. The things that he takes from the world, he goes and worships it as if that is some source of godliness. Chatzio soraf b'moesh, half of it he burns in fire. Al chatzio basar yochel, and half of it he uses to cook his meat. Yitzlat saliva yisba, and he satisfies his own stomach. Ap yachom, and he warms himself up. Vayomer ha'ach, and he says, I feel good. Chamosi ra'isi, or I feel warm, I can feel the fire. I feel so nice. And then he sheriso, and the rest of the wood le'elas ala pislo, he makes it into a pesel, he makes it into an idol. Yisgadlo, and he bows down to it. Vayishtachu, vayispelelav, and he prays to it. He takes those things that he took and he abused from the earth, and then he worships it. V'yomar hatzileni ki eliata, and he says, "Save me, you are my God." Worshipping the works of his own hands. When man, of course, nowadays we don't think that much of taking an idol, but when one admires the works of man and says, "Wow, this is the future. The future is this is what's so great. This is what's going to save me," is the creations of mankind. This is the same thing that Isaiah was criticizing thousands of years ago. Lo yadu v'lo yavinu, they do not understand, they do not know. This is verse 18. I want to go back to Yeshayahu chapter 11, verse 9, where again he expresses the same idea, right? Lo yareu v'lo yashchisu b'chol harkachi. They will stop cutting down and ruining things on my holy mountain. Ki malah haaretz dea es Adonai kamayim liyom mechasim. The world is going to fill with knowledge in the future. God is saying now, when one worships the creations of themselves, when one worships himself, what are they missing? Lo yad'u v'lo yavinu, he says now in verse 18. They do not know, they do not understand. Ki tachmer os eineihem me'askili bosam. Because their eyes are covered, their hearts cannot understand. When you're full of arrogance, when you're full of pride in yourself, then you don't understand and you don't get the real message. V'lo yashiv al libo, he will not be able to contemplate in his heart. V'lo das, he will not have knowledge. V'lo tavuna, he will not have understanding. Lemar, to say, chatzio sorafti b'mo'esh, v'afafisi al gechol lechem, etzla basar v'ochel, that I used this wood. In the one hand, I burned it. I used it for fire and flames to cook my food. And the remainder of this wood I'm going to use. This is just wood. This is a material. I could use it for a lot of things. I can use it for myself, but it's not a God. Right? The world that God gave us to use, yes, we can use it for all kinds of things for our benefit, but to make it into a God, that's the problem. Levul eitz esgo, to a chunk of wood I'm going to bow. This is still just nature. The bricks, the buildings, the wonderful things that man has created are wonderful and great and fine, you could use them, but to make them into a God, that's the problem. Ro'eh efer lev hu talhi tahu. He her he who chases after ashes, lev hu talhi tahu. His messed up, his twisted up heart has made him mistaken. It is his twisted heart of arrogance that has made him make this mistake. V'lo yatzilas nafsho, he will never save himself. V'lo yomar halo sheker bimini, and he's never going to be able to say that what I'm holding in my right hand is falsehood. This is I'm going to complete this chapter here just because it's all one long idea. So I'm going to continue with verse 21. Zechor Eile Yaakov, remember these things, Jacob v'Yisrael. Remember this idea. Remember this. Don't look at human creations. Don't look at human arrogance. Don't look at them for sources of salvation, because they will not be reliable. They will not last. But rather, remember, ki avdi ata. You are my servant. You know this message. This is the message that I want you to bring to the world. Yitzarticha, I have created you. Eved liata, you are a servant for me. Yisrael loti nasheni, God says, do not forget me. Do not forget that this is all me. I am the creator. I made this world for a reason. Not because of those creations, not so that you should be proud of what you made, but so that you should be humble, so that you should bring the message of tzedek u'mishpat, justice and righteousness to the world. That is why it's so important to recognize that it's not the wood that you created or the wonder of the things that man did, which are all well and good, but that's not God. God created the world for a reason, for a purpose. And the purpose is so that you should know this message and bring this message to the world. And then if you remember this, God says in verse 22, then I will erase like a cloud all of your sins. If you remember this and you bring this message, your sins will be gone. Just like a cloud blows away, your sins will blow away. Shuva Elai, God says, please return to me, because I have redeemed you. I have been with you this whole time because I know that you can carry this message to the world. Ranu Shamayim, and what will happen then? All the heavens will sing, Ki asa Adonai, Hariu Tachtios Aretz, because God has made you. Hariu, all of the land and earth will cry out in joy. Pitzchu Harim Rina, the mountains will break out in song. Yar v'chol eitzbo, all of the trees that everyone else is abusing and chopping down, all of those trees will break out in song because God will restore nature. Ki go'al Adonai es Yaakov, because God has redeemed Jacob of Israel Yispoar, and with Israel, God has gotten glorified. So says God, the one who has redeemed you, who created you from the beginning. I am God, the one who makes everything. I myself am the one who placed heavens where they are. It was from me that the land was laid out the way it is. I am telling you the signs of all of these diviners, these future tellers, prophets, false prophets, because all these people giving nonsense, magical nonsense. These are the ones, they are ruining true wisdom, and their knowledge is the true knowledge is made twisted and crooked by these false prophets and ideas. However, what do? Mekim devar avdo. I do establish strongly the words of his servant. Those are the words of Israel and the true teachers of Israel. Remember, again and again and again, that language, avdo, my servant, in this case, his servant, where it's in second person referring to the servant Israel. Vatsas malachav yashlim. The true advice and ideas of the true messengers of Israel, God will fulfill. Ha'omer l'Yerushalayim, I say to Jerusalem, Tushav, that you shall be settled again. Ul'arei Yudah tibonena, and I do say to the cities of Judah, you shall be built. V'charvosea ha'komem, and the destroyed areas, the areas that are ruined, I will reestablish. Ha'omer latzulach haravi, I have said to the deep depths that were flooding, I'll say dry up, stop causing floods. V'narosai chovish, the rivers coming out of the depths, the rivers coming out of the dark areas will stop, and only the rivers of bounty and beauty will flow. Ha'omer lekoresh ro'i, I am the one who says to Koresh, my Cyrus, my shepherd, I'm the one who tells him to redeem the world, to redeem Israel by bringing them back to Jerusalem. He will fulfill my desire, and say to Jerusalem, be built, and reestablish my home and my temple in Jerusalem. This last verse 28 is clearly is a reference to Cyrus, who was the king of Persia, who lived many centuries, about 2 or 3 centuries after Yeshayahu, after Isaiah wrote this prophecy. Now, obviously, those that believe that this part of the book was written long after will point to this verse, and we mentioned this before, as proof that Yeshayahu could not possibly have written this, given the fact that Cyrus is mentioned, and Cyrus was far from alive at the time. So they would point to the early days of the Second Temple period as the time this part was written. Obviously, just a couple of interesting points. It is clear from Yeshayahu that the vast majority, if not the entire book, with the small exception of the portions where Yeshayahu refers to himself directly, were written by Yeshayahu himself. These were prophecies that were written down most likely by his students, those that surrounded him, those that learned and cherished his words and wrote these prophecies down. That's the entire book from the beginning, and that's clear. From the book itself, it's clear that it wasn't Isaiah himself writing this, but it was people writing down the speeches and talks and ideas that he gave and taught. The fact that over here it's referred to Cyrus could be for several reasons, and I've said all along that these prophecies are so attached to and so similar to and so connected to the parts of the beginning of this book that I do believe that all of these prophecies were written by that same entity. In other words, that same group of people that wrote and recorded Yeshayahu's prophecies. It's extremely possible that these words of Isaiah were spoken and taught extensively during the early days of the Second Temple, when the Jews were coming back to that time and rebuilding the temple. And it was a very depressing time, as we will study one day the books of Ezra and Nehemiah and Nehemiah, when we discuss the rebuilding of the Second Temple and how desperate the situation was at the time. And certainly the works of Yeshayahu would have been of a tremendous amount of comfort. And it is extremely plausible to imagine that someone would have put in there, while reading these words about how God is going to rebuild Jerusalem, that yes, it is God that is telling Cyrus to bring us back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And it is through his messenger, Cyrus, that this would happen. So this verse could easily have been put in by someone at the time, which is not just logical to me, but actually sounds like the most plausible explanation. However, there's another plausible explanation, of course, and that is that Yeshayahu is a prophet, and prophets tell the future. And Yeshayahu is the one who wrote this down, and then in the future it came true, and he actually said it by name, which, for those of you that are willing to accept the whole idea of prophecy, then that would make a lot of sense. It's a famous fact. It's worth mentioning here that in Josephus, who was a Jewish historian in the later Second Temple times, in the times of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem near the end of the Second Temple time, he recorded in his book of Antiquities, and these are the words that he wrote. This was the history and this was the tradition, that Cyrus saw the prophecy written by Isaiah hundreds of years prior, and said as follows. I'm reading from an English translation of Josephus in Antiquities chapter 1, and this occurring in the first year of the reign of Cyrus. This was known to Cyrus in the first year of the reign of Cyrus, which was the 70th from the day our people, Josephus writes, the Jewish people were thrown out of Israel the first time into Babylon. It says, it was when Cyrus decided to send the people back to Jerusalem and rebuild it. And he says that this was known to Cyrus by his I'm reading Josephus' words, by his reading the book which Isaiah left behind him of his prophecies. For this prophet said that God had spoken thus to him in a secret vision. In other words, that Isaiah had prophesied that my will is that Cyrus, whom I have appointed king, to send back my people to their own land and build my temple. This was foretold by Yeshayahu, by Isaiah, 140 years before the temple was destroyed. Accordingly, when Cyrus read this and admired the divine power, an earnest desire and ambition seized upon him to fulfill what was so written. So he called for the most eminent Jews that were in Babylon and said to them that he gave them leave to go back to their own country and rebuild their city in Jerusalem. So in other words, Josephus is saying that Cyrus read the book of Isaiah, saw that it was prophesied that he himself was going to send them back to Jerusalem, and therefore he was filled with a spirit of desire to do that. Of course, Josephus wrote this several hundred years after the time of Cyrus, because Josephus was near the end of the Second Temple period, and Cyrus was obviously in the beginning of that period. However, it's important for me to mention this tradition of the Jewish people that was recorded by Cyrus. However, I still contend that as we see these ideas are repeated over and over and over again, and that it's clearly, there's clearly unity of authorship of the entire book. And however else, I think I laid out the various different ways to understand the reference to Koresh, to Cyrus here. This concludes our study of chapter 44. Looking forward to studying chapter 45 together next time.